Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are having a great start to your week and that the time change is not beating you up too much and that you're able to enjoy some of the extra sunshine we get at the end of the day. We're going to kick it off with federal updates. The State of the Union was last week, and President Biden delivered his address. In that address, he talked about inflation and high interest rates, and most notably, he proposed a $10,000 mortgage relief tax credit for first and second-time home buyers. He also mentioned plans to lift title insurance requirements on federally backed mortgages. Biden says he can fix America's housing affordability crisis. Jury is still out if it will work. And so we have included a link in the call notes on a piece that explores this. We also now have a budget, so no more continuing resolutions. We avoided a partial government shutdown on Friday when Congress passed 6 spending bills, one of which included the transportation, housing, and urban development portion, so housing is included. Those programs are now funded until the end of September, when the fiscal year 2024 budget ends. Some of the more controversial spending bills, such as the defense budget, are in the second portion of the bills that need to be passed by March 22nd to avoid another partial government shutdown. Biden also released his fiscal year 2025 budget yesterday, and in his proposed budget, it talks a lot about President Biden's policy priorities. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to stand much of a chance of passing within the Republican-led House. The proposed budget looks very similar to last year's, and we're still dissecting it, but so far, here are a few of the highlights of that budget. It does continue to encourage Congress to expand the low-income housing tax credit. It encourages the creation of the mortgage relief tax credit, which is what we highlighted from the State of the Union address. It funds a first-generation down payment assistance program, which is different than first-time home buyer. It expands rental assistance and increases funding for the expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And it also increases allocations for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, 502 single-family direct loan and the 515 rental housing direct loan. Also last week, the Treasury announced 3 new efforts to increase housing supply. It updated guidance for the American Rescue Plan Act's state and local fiscal recovery funds to make it easier for recipients to use the remaining funds to construct affordable housing. It also included some additional new clarifications to the ARP Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which make it clear that qualifying recipients can use the remaining funds on a broad range of uses to fund affordable housing serving very low-income families. And third, they released an extension of the Federal Financing Bank's financing support for a risk-sharing initiative between the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and the state and local housing finance agencies in order to lower the cost of creating and preserving affordable housing. In other federal news, HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge announced yesterday that she will be resigning later this month. This came as a surprise to many. I know it did to me. Since her resignation marks only the second secretary departure during Biden's term. With it being an election year, there are many Senate Democrats that aren't looking forward to spending a lot of floor time on the confirmation process for the next secretary. But in the meantime, Deputy Secretary Adrienne Todman will be serving as the acting secretary of HUD. Moving on to local community updates. In Winston-Salem, Salem Gardens undergoes a $40 million renovation in order to remain affordable for at least 30 years. It's in a part of a deal with the city, and Salem Gardens is a 150-unit apartment community for low-income residents in Winston-Salem. It will be receiving a $3 million loan from the city as part of a larger $40 million renovation. In return, the new owners have agreed to keep the property affordable for at least 30 additional years, and renovations are planned in a way that's intended to not displace residents. UNC student organizations run organization Solar Equity recently received a donation of 275 solar panels and is actually partnering with Empowerment Inc. to solarize their new affordable housing development, Peach Apartments. The 10-unit complex is for residents earning between 30 and 60% of the area median income, and each household is expected to see a monthly savings on their energy bill of around $37. Moving on to a few news out of the eastern part of our state. Actually, still in the Triangle. The city of Raleigh approved the creation of a transit overlay district along New Bern Avenue. Raleigh City Council voted last week to approve a transit overlay district for certain areas along this corridor, this bus rapid transit corridor. There were some neighbors that were concerned that this overlay would intensify gentrification and displacement for the low-income, long-time residents, and council ultimately sent planning staff back to parse the land into smaller tracts to consider for rezoning. Also in Wake County schools have experienced an 88% increase in the number of homeless students. About 3.5% of Wake County's 150,000 students are experiencing homelessness, unfortunately. And according to the school system, most students and families that are experiencing homelessness have been evicted and aren't able to afford the security deposit and first month's rent for a new place to live. A $1.3 million federal COVID grant that the school system has relied on to provide before and after school care and tutoring for students experiencing homelessness must be expended later this year. So the school system is reaching out to several community groups for replacement funding and encourages anyone who is interested in supporting students in transition to reach out. Finally, the Wilson Housing Authority is accepting Housing Choice Voucher pre-applications through March 26th. And so interested individuals can pick up a pre-application at the Wilson Housing Authority Administration Building or by printing the PDF that can be found on the front page of their website and that we have linked in our call notes for you. Moving on to events, there will be a webinar around the Biden-Harris administration's housing policy agenda hosted by the Urban Institute. It's on March 12th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Another webinar from the Federal Housing Finance Agency will be happening on March 13th from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. So it's more of a symposium, and this will be looking at the Federal Housing Finance Agency's multifamily insurance, the latest trends, the latest issues facing multifamily properties. And we know insurance has been a big topic recently for us, both in North Carolina and nationally. And also on March 13th, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition from 1 to 2 p.m. will be hosting a webinar titled Changes to the Community Reinvestment Act, an Opportunity for Asset Building Philanthropy. And resources, we just have a few to lift up for you today. The Urban Institute has a great resource titled How to Embed Racial Equity into Zoning Code Reform. Another piece from the Urban Institute talks about mergers between lenders and real estate agencies and how that could be positive for the mortgage market. And another piece out of the National, excuse me, my dog is stressing out a little bit. Another piece titled The Racial Wealth Divide and Black Homeownership, New Data Shows Small Gains but Deep Fragility, is an interesting look at the racial wealth gap, and that is a piece by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. In the news, we have several things in the news, but one thing we wanted to lift up in particular is that later this week, the gap report from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition comes out on Thursday. So be on the lookout for an email from us with the key highlights and takeaways. We also wanted to mention that next week we will not be having a housing call. Some of us will be in Washington, D.C. at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's annual policy forum. So we will be back with you at our usual time on Tuesday, March 26th, and we can't wait to share what we learned in D.C. with you. Going back to in the news, Shelterforce has a piece talking about running rampant, how short-term rentals affect communities with loose restrictions. Another piece out of Governing talks about the need to protect unspent affordable housing money. And I will lift this up semi-selfishly. This is the very first time where my professional career and my Netflix watching decisions have intersected like this. So the other week, I got to have a pretty interesting conversation with a reporter from the Business Insider, where we talked a little bit about Love is Blind, the show on Netflix that essentially tries to matchmake people sight unseen, and they have to get married. But that's not the premise of this piece. The premise of the piece is these townhomes that they are placed in for a portion of the show. This is also in my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, and apparently there's been a lot of pushback online about how these townhomes look. And so it's a really interesting conversation for me. And so we've linked that in the call notes. So just in the news, an example of how there's really a variety of reactions to this form of sort of middle housing popping up. And, you know, the difference between looking at it from an aesthetic lens versus an affordable housing lens. So this is a really odd, like surreal experience for me. Another few pieces that I want to lift up for you out of the Atlantic, there's a piece titled "The Only Force Stronger Than Polarization is Rising Home Prices." So this is definitely something that highlights, sadly, the increasing but also almost unifying crisis that is happening for people all over the country when it comes to the rising cost of living. The New York Times also mentions cost of living, particularly in high mortgage rates, and how that really is pressuring folks at the federal level to look at policies and potential interventions for housing relief. And then another piece out of Cardinal and Pine, it's an op-ed, and it talks about how rising rent is crushing folks in rural North Carolina. So I will leave you there. We do have a few other pieces that you can check out linked in the call notes. Once again, don't forget to look out for an email from us about the GAP report, the 2024 GAP report from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We'll be having a piece released looking at North Carolina and how some of the standout data points from this year, but also how we compare to last year. And then remember again that we will not be having a housing call next week, but we will be back on March 26th, and we can't wait to reconnect with you then. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything or you want us to address anything specific. Talk to you next time.